Hello, everyone. This is my podcast once again, and we have an interesting guest today, Eric Schliesser. He's a professor at the University of Amsterdam and in political science, but he's also a philosopher. And now, perhaps that's a good question for you to answer right away. Do you consider yourself a political scientist or philosopher?
Ah, um, that's actually a tough question. I think I'm in many ways still very much a philosopher. So I have my PhD in philosophy, and I tend to publish mostly in philosophy journals and philosophy book series. And I usually think of my audience as philosophical, but I have noticed that in my teaching, I am much less focused on arguments and reconstructing arguments than I used to be. In fact, I almost don't do that at all anymore.
Hmm.
Um, and um, and I also like a lot of things about being in a political science program, particularly my own program, because we're methodologically incredibly diverse and that I find very attractive. So there's a sense in which uh, uh, I'm naturally attracted to political science, but
Hmm.
I don't see myself as contributing to um, the mainstream political science debates in a way that I think on the margins I'm trying to do in philosophy.
Right. Yeah. So it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I guess one thing to consider here is that some people might be surprised, at least about political philosophy, which is a thriving area in philosophy, perhaps hasn't always been. But a lot of political philosophers are hired into political science departments, right?
Yes, this is especially true in Europe and in the UK. I think in the States, political theory is actually struggling a bit.
Hmm.
So there are not many jobs there. But
Right.
in the last decade and a half, I would say that political theory or political philosophy has really been booming in political science
Hmm.
departments in Europe and in the UK.
Right. I don't know if
Um,
you know the
yeah.
statistics, but do you think there's an even split with political philosophers going into either philosophy departments or political science departments?
No, I don't think so. I think for better and for worse, political scientists are more open-minded than political
Hmm.
than philosophy departments. So um, I know of very few cases where philosophy departments will hire somebody who clearly is a political scientist,
Yeah.
and then appoint him. It might happen when somebody does formal philosophy or simulations. But on the whole, I think political scientists are much more ecumenical in their decision making
Hmm.
generally. Um, I mean, particularly in Europe and in the UK, but also I think there's also an interesting sociological conceptual issue is that for many bread and butter political scientists and social scientists, the expertise that philosophers bring is normative in character, and and the training of normative theory takes place, you might say, in philosophy departments on this view, even
Hmm.
though surely there are normative theorists that get trained either by, once professional philosophers like myself or people with interest in normative theory in political science departments. But I think the directionality is not symmetrical. I would really be surprised if it were. But
Hmm.
we should ask Eric Switchkable or somebody like that to do some data crunching on it.
Yeah, no, it would be interesting to see. I wonder if there is the data even, because we might keep track of who's hired into philosophy departments, but
Mm.
I'm not sure whether Phil Jobs, which is a philosophy website, keeping track of these issues to some extent,
Mm.
if they keep track of all the hiring happening in political science department. Would be interesting to see, certainly. Now, as a philosopher of science who's very interested in exploring, yeah, into not only writing about, say, the philosophy of sciences, but really
Mhm.
being in there, trying to talk to scientists, contributing to the ongoing work of scientists themselves and the theoretical problems they are interested in, the philosophical challenges they are facing. It's perhaps unique then for political science, where philosophers are actively hired, but I suppose less so on the philosophy of science, of political science, and more on the normative aspects about how we should, say, define justice, what is fairness, uh,
Yes.
right?
So the first thing to note is that there is really incredibly little work on the philosophy of political science, broadly conceived.
Hmm.
So, in fact, the philosophy of special sciences, which, and I include physics in
Yeah.
that list, somewhat controversially, that the philosophy of special sciences has really notable omissions. And there's,
Hmm.
I think, if you would scholar Google philosophy of political science, I would be amazed if there'd be more than half a dozen papers on it.
Hmm.
And now, when I got hired, I didn't think of myself as especially a political philosopher. I did think of myself as a historian of philosophy and a philosopher of social science.
Yeah.
And I got the sense that some people on the hiring committee at the time viewed me as, let's call it STS friendly. And they themselves, I mean,
Yeah.
so political science itself is incredibly heterogeneous.
Hmm.
And there were among the people involved in that decision people that do things that are themselves adjacent to STS. And in fact, there are people in my department that would, yeah, self-describe as STS. So
Hmm.
I think there there are other kinds of overlaps one might expect, but in general, people don't like getting unsolicited advice. So I don't think it's my job to tell my colleagues how to do social science
All right.
better. That's, I restrict myself to the economist in that respect. But yeah, and also in many ways, um, I wouldn't be able to tell them how to do that. I'm mostly learning from them about methods I previously was unfamiliar with or hadn't
Hmm.
thought about in a long time.
So you did your PhD at the University of Chicago, which is sometimes described as the best university for economics, at least from the perspective
Ah,
of Chicago style
yeah.
economics. What was your PhD on?
My PhD was in really a PhD in the history of philosophy, history of philosophy of science. So I looked at the reception of Newton by David Hume
Hmm.
and Adam Smith. That was sort of the core of the dissertation. And then as it unfolded, I actually did get interested in some of the political angles to this, as I added a chapter on Rousseau um, and Rousseau's political economy, how it sort of fit into this narrative arc that I was shaping. I don't think anybody involved in my dissertation, including myself, thought it had a really singular unity, the argument. That
Hmm.
was really interlocking essays. And that, yeah, I guess that continued to this day. I didn't have a lot of contact with the economics faculty, but I did have contact with economics PhDs, either in the economics department or the business school. And some of them have remained, lifelong acquaintances. So
Hmm.
I wasn't wholly unfamiliar with the economics that was being practiced, but I had uh, a colleague, Jennifer Bubar, and she worked in philosophy of economics and was really very close to Heckman, who eventually won a Nobel Prize. So there were possibilities to do really embedded economics, but my own interest in Chicago economics really was not. Was sort of an effect of my dissertation and
Hmm.
not part of the cause. So I started to get invited to events where more contemporary economics would be discussed. I also got asked to teach a course in the philosophy of economics. And then my interest in Chicago economics was an effect of that more than that I came into philosophy, philosophy of science wanting to talk about that. That came later in my development.
Right. And would you still describe that as one of your focus areas at the moment?
Yeah, less so than about a decade ago, when I was really writing, I think, a paper a year on some aspect of Chicago economics. Now, now I still draw on it because I'm working on a project connected to Foucault's interpretation of 20th century economics. And so that often draws me into Chicago economics. And I'm writing papers on the development of analytic philosophy and its entanglement with other intellectual disciplines, including
Hmm.
Chicago economics. So it's not like I'm completely uninterested in um, doing papers and projects in the area. And sometimes it really leads to original research, but it's not my main focus the way it was, I guess, yeah, even when I was hired by the University of Amsterdam.
Right. That's interesting. You mentioned that you're working on a paper on the connection between the history of analytic philosophy and the history of economics there.
Yeah.
So what is this connection?
So I said what I'm about to say I've long felt. I think there is an enormous overlap in the history of economics and the history of philosophy, so that many really rather famous
Hmm.
philosophers have non-trivial economic theories and economic and contributions to economic analysis. Obviously, Hume and Smith, in my view,
Yeah.
are paradigmatic cases of that. But I actually think Plato is another person for whom this is fairly
Hmm.
obvious. Um, um, Locke, this is also fairly obvious. And this obviousness goes through Sidgwick, right? And the utilitarian tradition more generally has a non-trivial overlap with history of philosophy and economics. Um, and then I had a more focused clay that I really have never managed to develop into, let's call it fine-grained scholarship. And that is I want to claim that Cambridge University in England from 1870 to about the First World War, where arguably one strand of analytic philosophy was invented, the people who did the inventing were themselves in part deeply shaped by the history of economics and the history of ethics. So if you think of
Hmm.
people like Sidgwick and Keynes and Ramsey, these are, very obvious examples, but also the father of Keynes, John Neville Keynes, the logician Johnson. These are all people who, in this ambiance, are making contributions to both philosophy and to economics. And that, in a weird way, even though some of them are super familiar and very famous, I don't feel, and that, somebody like Cheryl Mizak, I think, has done a wonderful job at calling alert attention to. I don't think that uh, this cauldron of intellectual creativity and the fact that economics and philosophy are so important to each other. I might also mention Wittgenstein and Straffa,
Hmm.
in Brighton, maybe Hayek as well, although he's not at Cambridge. I think this is something that's underexplored in the history of both disciplines, even though it's not like there's a big secret here. I think you could tell a similar story about, say, somebody like Neurath and the Mises brothers in
Hmm.
Vienna. So I think I just find these are incredibly rich intellectual uh, connections that, yeah, there's still arbitrage opportunities, to use an
Yeah.
economics term.
As
And
opposed.
also, maybe the last thing to say about it is that I think American analytic philosophy is very importantly shaped by a guy called Ernest Nagel. And Nagel's philosophy of science, which I have worked on, was really very well known and respected by the leading American economists of
Hmm.
his own generation. So Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, they all knew and engaged with his philosophy of science, and in turn treated him as a respectful interlocutor when writing about economic methodology. So
Hmm.
I think there are, yeah, really interesting connections here.
I suppose one obvious example where economics influenced philosophy is when it comes to rational choice theory,
Yeah,
what it means for someone to be rational. I think we
yeah.
are quite influenced by economics there, right?
Absolutely. Game theory, I think similarly, maybe more suppressed these days. But
Hmm.
Gibbert is still alive, so I think yeah, the connections are very deep. And I myself think if you look even at not just the rationality debates, but also discussions about philosophy of mind and even philosophy of biology, your area, you
Hmm.
see in all the classic papers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, economic metaphors, economic principles,
Hmm.
cross-referencing, not just on the Darwinian side, but also toward economic stuff. So um, I think, yeah, future historians can have a field day with that material.
No, that's right. I've written a bit about this, and I was considering writing my dissertation on it, but it wouldn't have perhaps been as, say, interesting just trying to draw the connections there. At least I was discouraged from writing too much of a historical dissertation, which is perhaps
Yeah,
surprising in a history and philosophy of science department.
yeah,
But perhaps the contributions are more seen and what are the unique theses you are coming up with and defending rather than looking into history. But yeah, history has always been very interesting to me. And certainly when it comes to game theory, evolutionary game theory, there has
exactly.
been
Yeah,
so much back and forth between
yeah.
the scientists, and looking at that is quite fascinating. I've
Mm.
written, in fact, published at least one paper on the subject.
Which
And
paper was that again? I think I may have seen it at some point.
yeah, I think, let me check the name. So that paper was on the history of evolutionary game theory and
Oh yeah,
integration.
yeah.
I think it's called evolutionary game theory and integration
Hey, this is your
across.
podcast. We should be advertising your work, Walter.
Yeah, so it's called evolutionary game theory and interdisciplinary integration.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've recorded some episodes where I just read out my papers and give comments and how
Mm,
my views have changed and the like.
mm,
Um,
mm.
Perhaps I'll do one on that paper.
Excellent.
Um,
Were you were at you were your PhD was in Sydney, right? Or am I
that's right,
misremembering?
in Sydney.
Yeah,
Um,
I have this meta theory that HBS is dying a little bit, and so your
hmm,
anecdotal evidence is kind of a bit of a confirmation bias for me. Um,
yeah, I
I think
think,
there, yeah, I think there's a generational shift happening where people like me were not
hmm,
actively discouraged from working on
yeah,
historical projects within a, let's call it HBS environment. And,
hmm,
I very, my self-identity for many years was philosophy of science slash history of philosophy.
hmm,
And I really feel like in the last 15 years, in many countries and in many HBS departments, the philosophers are disengaging from, let's call it more history focused projects.
hmm. Yeah, I wonder if that's almost exclusively due to the fact that there's simply not that many HBS departments, so you're
Yeah,
most likely going to get a job in a philosophy
yeah,
department, and then
yeah,
the best job advice is to focus on the philosophy
yeah,
side.
yeah,
I mean, there
yeah,
are some history of science departments, but there typically they'd also hire someone who focuses on history of science. So,
yeah.
as so often is the case, interdisciplinarity often doesn't pay off for people,
No,
right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I
It's
don't.
yeah, yeah.
My own career suggests is that sometimes one has no idea where one will end up in. And I mean, I did have a political science bachelor degree, so it
Yeah.
wasn't like I was completely ignorant of the field. But
Hmm.
I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. Certainly, uh, once my PhD writing started, it never occurred to me that I would ever get a job in the political science department. So in that
Hmm.
sense, yeah, don't underestimate what's the word you Darwinians like to use? Um, Not coincidence, but happenstance or whatever.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that philosophers can draw a lot on economic theories. In fact,
Mm,
my dissertation on evolution of consciousness, as well as
mm,
book,
yeah.
is basically drawing on a lot of metaphors from economics, where
Yeah.
I am not sure you've heard of life history theory, but it
No.
essentially treats organisms as agents, or you might even call them firms that have to solve a maximization problem
Decent
under
problems. Yeah. And
constraints,
optimism.
right?
Yeah.
And you have multiple things you could invest in,
Yeah.
longer limbs, say, but there's a cost associated with this, and there's trade-offs to be calculated. And then
Mm,
essentially, just like a firm has to do an optimization here, similarly, organisms have to make one, and then similarly to how agents have to make decisions, and they need a common currency for making those decisions. They might calculate this in terms of, say, the dollar as a common currency. We can also think of the evolution of sentience as a common currency that enabled organisms at some point to better calculate those trade-offs,
yeah.
s- these various stimuli in something like a common currency. And from our utilitarian perspective, of course, that's great because we want to explain at which point there are these benthemite creatures that are able to experience pleasure and pain. And it's a
Yeah.
very old idea that has inspired philosophers for ages. So I'm hardly the first one to try um, to provide some an empirical backbone to that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So really, maybe I should revise my original claim and say, look, actually, and this is historically also plausible to say,
Hmm.
look, there are all these overlaps between economics, philosophy, and biology and
Hmm.
adjoining projects. And there's a recurring temptation and interest to try to reinvigorate them by borrowing from each other in
Hmm.
various ways. And you're living that.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah, it's, I guess, partly also part of philosophy discourages the use of metaphors, of all terms you might call anthropomorphizing or these
yeah,
agential words. But if you're
mm,
inspired by people like Dennett, then you don't have as much qualms really
mm,
borrowing these terms from different fields to build bridges and perhaps make progress. And perhaps that's a good bridge to an article you once wrote,
mm,
a review essay on both Daniel Dennett's book, no, not Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Um, what was it called?
mm. From
Bacteria to
bacteria
Bach
to
and Beck.
Bach, yeah,
Yeah.
Bach, yeah,
And
yes,
Peter Godfrey Smith's book, Other Minds. And you call
yeah,
this synthetic philosophy, that they were engaged in a unique style of philosophy.
yeah.
Yeah, perhaps you can tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've known Dan Dennett since my undergrad days. He was a teacher of mine at Tufts, and we've also stayed in touch at various points since. I'd actually written a paper on one of his other works, I think, a few years before, so I'd kind of
Hmm.
refamiliarized myself with his views. Um, and this paper originated in an invitation from Michael Weisberg, in philosophy and biology editor then, or book review editor perhaps. And he basically said to me, I don't want a normal book review. I want you to pretend as if you're writing for the New York Review of Books. And that was
Hmm.
very helpful to me because um, I don't I wouldn't feel comfortable writing for the audience of philosophy and biology and tell them the qua philosophers of biology, here's what's important about these texts. I'm an amateur in that respect. But I did think it interesting that when I read them, it was very clear to me that they were doing something that wasn't what the mainstream in analytic philosophy is
Hmm.
saying about itself that it's doing. So I'd been reading um, Stolyar's book on philosophy of progress, Williamson on methodology, the Chalmers meta philosophy book, and I really myself had been very interested in methodological debates about philosophy, some of them prompted by X-Fi and those kind of projects. Some of them also, I think, having to do with my own interest in what really is the point of history of philosophy in philosophy departments. So when I wrote that piece, I thought, well, I've been given carte blanche to talk about the big picture and to do something different. And I was also kind of curious if I could write a piece that might go viral. So I was really very self-conscious about the fact that this was an interesting opportunity. And um, what I noticed immediately is that neither Dennett nor Peter Godfrey Smith proceeds like ordinary analytic philosophers. The kind of arguments they offer, the kind of
Hmm.
distinctions they offer, let's put it, the whole aesthetic is very different. And at the same time, it's super interesting and super fascinating. And so, what I wanted to do was really try to characterize the commonality between them in such a way that, from the point of view of a cocktail party or department library discussion about what the discipline is, it would be completely obvious that what they're doing is something distinct from what others are
Hmm.
doing. Now, I also felt as the years went by, I was a little bit unhappy with my own formulation. And this was because somewhat pleasantly, people did read this piece and started running with it, I think, including you at some point or another. And then I realized that I had really myself equivocated between two conceptions of synthetic philosophy. In both conceptions, what philosophers of science do is bring things together from different disciplines.
Hmm.
Um, but in one conception, and one that I favor myself now, the way they bring things together is by way of some kind of further scientific or mathematical or theoretical model, such that the the glue between the different disciplines is a form of expertise that the synthetic philosopher has in virtue of being an expert in, say, Darwinian theory or game theory or
Hmm.
category theory or rational choice theory, etc., such that behind the bringing together of different disciplines, there's expertise, and that this expertise can shape both philosophy and special sciences that are being brought together, and perhaps even the wider culture, because I think both Dennett and Godfrey Smith are not just speaking to philosophers and biologists, but also to a much broader culture. And also creating projects, cultural and political and social and scientific projects for
Hmm.
these other fields. So that was my own view, but the way I presented it, I really emphasized first the big picture, bringing together stuff. And some people quite naturally thought I was sounding a lot like Kitcher, and I guess a whole century of naturalists, where the project really is to tell a big picture story about the nature of reality. And then what brings things together is really a kind of creative genius or create mystical creative intuition of the philosopher, not so much as an expert practitioner, but as a kind of cultural legislator of sorts.
Hmm.
And while I think it's not entirely unfair to say that my own work sometimes flirts with that model, I actually really felt that what's distinctive about synthetic philosophy, as I was trying to describe it, is not the creative genius model, but really the philosopher, the synthetic philosopher as a bearer of a certain kind of expertise. And so the paper went viral. I realized that in some respects I sounded like Kitcher, in other respects that I was echoing Tim Lewin. So since then, I've also tried to make my debts to others and distinctions clearer. But I do think there is such a thing as being an expert on a certain kind of theory or model and using that expertise to bring other disciplines together in new ways or to shape them. And that's what I really mean by synthetic philosophy.
Hmm.
Um, I've also, since I wrote that piece, gotten really interested again in the intellectual division of labor. And so now I'm inserting the narrative about synthetic philosophy in a more general, let's call it analysis of the intellectual division of labor and its history. And I'm now talking myself into claiming that responding to the intellectual division of labor is kind of constitutive of the philosophic enterprise as such that if you go all the way back to Plato, there's a real anxiety and also diagnosis of that how the division of labor, intellectual labor generates social and intellectual challenges, and philosophy is in a way the answer to it. So I'm now starting to tell a kind of origin story of synthetic philosophy that
Hmm.
is meant to capture a good chunk of the history of philosophy itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I said that Philip Kitcher sort of conceptualized synthetic philosophy as bringing things together through creativity,
Yeah,
inventive genius, because he was the advisor of Peter Godfrey Smith.
yeah,
So for him to then also do a synthetic philosophy seems very natural.
yeah.
Um, yeah, in my dissertation, in fact, I started out writing quite a long paragraph. I've sent them to you at some point
uh,
about what the activity I'm doing here, the meta philosophy of this dissertation. But dissertations actually don't have that much space, so I had to cut back
no,
on that drastically and yeah, basically framed my work in terms of the philosophical work, yeah, of Peter Godfrey Smith, Daniel Dennett, other Darwinian philosophers such as Ruth Millikan, where you try to use Darwinian theory essentially to make progress on some big philosophical
yeah.
problems and drawing things together, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And the latter would, for me, fall squarely in synthetic philosophy. It's just
hmm,
that the moment you think that Darwinian theory cannot do the job by itself, but really requires this sort of yeah, let's call it creativity. Even though I don't want to claim that applying Darwinian theory is just something mechanical. It requires its
hmm.
own creative reinterpretation of a lot of things, and sometimes even new results. I yeah, I'm a bit allergic to the idea that philosophy is a kind of alchemy of conceptual alchemy of different projects that we can somehow, without fully understanding how, can bring together and then make progress. That view of philosophy, it's not that I'm allergic to, but I really
Hmm.
don't think that it's wise to think that's what synthetic philosophy is or should be.
Yeah, I suppose for those interested in Darwinism, their, yeah, say evolutionary theory just provides something like perhaps a grand unifying theory of
Yeah.
unification
Yes.
where it's not just a local theory that might combine two things, but
Yeah.
there is a hope that it could provide a glue that is really wide-reaching,
Yes.
um, really could bring together the biological and social sciences, perhaps less so physics and chemistry, but that's not really the goal. Although some people say that perhaps we can apply Darwinian theory in those circumstances as well. Less convinced of that. But for the philosopher, of course, I think in a way, it here is really where the big problems arise. That is sort of the connections between, oh, well, we have this biology, this chemistry of the brain here, and then we have the mind, consciousness. How can we connect these two problems? As Wilfred Sellars said, we need to, yeah, really build this bridge to to narrow this gap as much as possible. And that's a
And
very distinct style of naturalistic philosophy where you're not really engaged in trying to break things apart, but you're really trying to connect things.
Yeah, I think I really want to make two observations about this. We agree to a large extent, so that makes it perhaps a bit exciting for our
Hmm.
audience. But I want to specify something. I think if you look at the origin of species, it's quite striking how many
Hmm.
different distinct fields
Yeah.
are really brought together in it. I think I don't know if I put this in my original paper, but you can do a whole list, and it's like 10 or 11 different
Hmm.
specialized disciplines that Darwin managed to bring together in the book. One reason why I mentioned Rachel Carson in the original paper was that I also thought it was interesting that she used Darwinian style reasoning in the context not just of, helping found environmentalism, modern environmentalism, but
Hmm.
also to help us think about ecology and to help us think about the interaction of between political decision making and inductive risk. So I thought actually those are cases, both cases where the Darwinism brings a lot of stuff together, including stuff that you disciplines you might not originally think belong together.
Hmm.
And really show what can be done. Now, uh, Dennett, actually in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, he coined this term Darwin's universal asset
Hmm.
for much, let's call it more capacious idea about what Darwinism can do. And one to me amusing realization I had this past year as I started to think again about synthetic philosophy and actually look at Spencer and his reception, it's quite clear that late 19th century philosophers were very enamored by the idea of a universal asset, where they
Hmm.
start doing Darwinian cosmology and start trying to give Darwinian foundations to chemistry and even the laws of physics, right? So, in some ways, Dan in Dennett in Darwin's Dangerous Idea is actually a bit tentative about this possibility. But if you look at Huxley and Pierce, they're much more capacious about the possibility of a universal asset. I don't think those projects have really stood the test of time all that well. So I think your comparative modesty, I think, is the wiser way to go. But I do think that Darwinism itself, among the synthetic glues that one might engage in,
Hmm.
itself has a tendency towards uh, uh, rather ambitious projects. Because it provides an explanatory template that is really not topic neutral, but can be inserted in all kinds of different uh, parts of life. And I think, to give an example, we haven't talked yet about, but I think in medicine, we've only just barely started to really apply Darwinian reasoning
Hmm.
systematically. I mean, it's been existing for, I don't know, half a century easily, but to really think through what it might mean in all kinds of areas of medicine, yeah, we're just starting to do that.
Yeah, I couldn't
Um,
agree more. My
yeah,
whole PhD has been funded by a project that was essentially on Darwinian medicine,
yeah,
trying to investigate how we can make progress in the concepts used in evolutionary medicine and the like.
yeah,
And yeah, I've written even a paper with my wife Hedda Browning on evolutionary veterinary science,
yeah,
which you might be surprised isn't really a thing. And people haven't really tried to explore this, despite the fact that it seems like a phylogenetic approach would be extremely helpful if you're trying to study and cure diseases across this vast range of the animal kingdom. How can
yeah,
we apply knowledge, say, of curing heart disease in one animal to somewhere else and the like, broken bones? Yeah, but there has been some resistance to this, partly due to the fact that I think mechanistic developmental biologists for a
mhm,
long time have been very resistant um, towards evolutionary theory. Part of that was in France, in Germany, it was seen as this English theory that shouldn't be applied.
Mm.
So there's some interesting a curiosity of history where some scientific theories were just coded by nationalities, and then
Yes.
within the context of your own country, you
Mm.
don't want to apply that, right?
Yeah. No, there are these, let's call them cultural national path dependencies.
Right.
My own wife is a surgeon and a neuroscientist, and she's gotten very interested in
Hmm.
the gut and its role in pathologies in medicine. And by accident, I was at this conference just a few weeks ago where the relationship between philosophy and science was like the main theme. And two of the
Hmm.
people there were people working on um, yeah, the gut in various ways. Also funded by medicine, of course. And what I noticed when I was listening to them is that they're basically applying ecological tropes to the
Hmm.
study of these of the gut um, uh, uh, and bacteria and other organisms that live there. And there was really striking is that I don't think ecology is such a high status field in contemporary
Hmm.
biomedicine, broadly conceived. But it's really the one that's giving them the ways of thinking about how they should think about what they're finding. So I'm not sure my wife and I are going to follow you and write a paper together, but we have discussed that we both noticed this. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I have a scheduled podcast with an exercise scientist actually, where interestingly, though philosophers haven't ever talked about this yet, exercise science routinely deals with philosophy of science questions because
Mm.
their sample sizes are terrible, the studies last for very short times, so they
Mm.
constantly have to deal with these challenging questions of we have these badly designed studies, but we have to make these terrible trade-offs. How do
Mm.
we combine insights from various fields to make progress? And similarly, there, from an evolutionary perspective, you could think about how the human body is designed. Why is it that we are prone, say, to lose muscles if we're inactive? What diseases might come from our modern lifestyle, and the like? And medicine has only recently started to look into this more, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, agreed. And I wasn't thinking about exercise science at all, but yeah, it's pretty. Once you mention it, it's that, yeah, of course. And I think um, you put your finger on something important more generally is that um, philosophy of science has this very weird status that my own, and I don't think this is true for every department, but
Hmm.
I think philosophy of science isn't as central to professional philosophy as it was, say, half a century ago,
Hmm.
where people could claim like it was like the first philosophy even. I mean, if you look at a description of what's counted as core philosophy in the last couple of decades, philosophy of science is never mentioned in that list. But at the
Hmm.
same time, unlike some other parts of philosophy that are not core but thereby marginal, I don't think that's true of philosophy of science. I think philosophers of science have relatively high status in the discipline. Um, but uh, it's both a discipline that talks to itself and other philosophers. I'll give an example. Timothy Williamson, in his methods of philosophy, now routinely appeals to abduction, and it routinely will treat modal logic, I think, as science. Maybe I'm misremembering that last
Hmm.
point, so apologies, but I thought he does that. And so there are these philosophy of science arguments and tropes that are shaping methodological debates within philosophy for good and for worse, I should say. And at the same time, whenever you study any science, any special science for a considerable amount of time, you discover that either past philosophy of science has played a role in shaping its own
Hmm.
self-understanding, or that contemporary philosophy of science can actually, contribute to some of the internal debates because we're a part that thinks about a lot of these issues in a systematic way. Whereas for special sciences, it comes up in discussion, but it's not part of their special training. So that was also one of the motives to actually say, hey, synthetic philosophy is something that's done by philosophers of science, so that could
Hmm.
easily be done not just in philosophy departments, but in other places. I think there's some philosophy programs, PhD programs, that actually their PhD graduates don't all end up in philosophy departments. Think of Carnegie Mellon, especially, and
Hmm.
perhaps Irvine and maybe Munich, where the training in formal philosophy and aspects of philosophy of science actually make the graduates, maybe LSE would also be a place that one would naturally think of it, where the graduates end up not just in philosophy departments, but contributing to the special sciences because they have very special methodological expertise.
Hmm.
Um, um, uh, I don't think philosophy of science is big enough actually to be imperialistic about this, but you could see it happening with individuals.
Yeah, before I started my PhD, I did in fact myself consider to do that kind of PhD focusing on modeling, especially
Yeah,
because I was so interested in evolutionary game theory. But then
yeah,
if you look at the trajectory of people working in that field, typically then that's what you do for the rest of your life.
in
You
life,
create
yeah,
those models and
yeah.
try to connect them to interesting questions. But sometimes then it seems like you're too confined, perhaps, in your, say, toolkit in what you can do.
Mhm.
Um, so in a way, I think it goes against synthetic philosophy there because, or typically synthetic philosophers have these very interdisciplinary interests and they don't want to be confined to any particular methods. Perhaps Darwinism, though, itself is again constrained there, no different from someone who's specializing in game theory, evolutionary game theory, agent-based models.
Yeah, so
Hmm,
I think it's fair to say that the kind of hyper specialization that many scientific careers require,
yeah,
that philosophy as a profession has has not embraced, and that even
hmm,
people that do what you and I might call synthetic philosophy tend to be, relatively speaking, more jacks of all trades than actual scientists. I think this might be shifting a bit already because we certainly have expert colleagues who spend most of their lives thinking about Bayesianism already.
hmm,
And I could easily see it happen that we have colleagues who spend most of their lives working with agent-based models,
yeah,
and that older papers exhibit that. And I would not frown on that. Um, but I agree with you that the attraction of being in a philosophy program is that we allow ourselves and each other method jumping. And I
hmm,
certainly wouldn't want to say that most of the synthetic philosophers that I admire are experts in only one kind of model or one kind of technique.
yeah,
That's not, yeah, that's not the norm
hmm.
in philosophy.
It's interesting to see.
Um,
I mean, Brian Skyrms is perhaps
yeah,
the best exemplar of someone who has used these models to great effect. He has become quite influential.
yeah,
Um, Another example would be Kim Sterelny, who's a synthetic
mm,
philosopher, but he doesn't do the models himself. He's
yeah,
hiring postdocs to do
yeah,
that, or he's collaborating with scientists who are doing that kind of work.
mm,
And I suppose that's something philosophers are still learning or in
yeah.
a process of that they can just collaborate with others that are experts in particular methodologies to combine their expertise to create good work.
Yeah, and I don't think of myself as especially pioneering, but I have enjoyed the fact that in my lifetime, the norm against solo authoring in philosophy has been considerably relaxed.
Hmm.
So I've now, I think, I don't know, a dozen papers that I've co-authored, and they often are works on either the history of economics, where I think the my co-author knows something really important
Yeah.
that I don't know about economics, or in my own case, the history of Forgotten Woman, where I've collaborated with a number of people. Um, and yeah, most recently, work in applied ethics and let's call it
Hmm.
applied political theory, where my counterpart is drawing on special expertise, including ones in linguistics. So I think yeah, I feel very fortunate that I'm born when I'm born, where that's allowed and where we can do that without people, making very a lot of fun of us. I do think it'd be interesting to see whether philosophers end up on these incredibly large, big science projects
Hmm.
that we're also seeing.
Yeah.
I have seen philosophers of science sign, editorials in Nature and those kind of places for kind of methodological purposes, but I haven't yet seen philosophers really be part of very big science.
Hmm. Well,
Um, and,
I can tell you that I'm similar to Hedda, currently involved with multiple papers with
uh,
some of them over 10 researchers
oh
in
yeah,
within animal welfare science,
yeah,
and we're providing our philosophical expertise there. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, hopefully those will result in papers.
yeah,
You can never know with so many people what the end result will be.
yeah,
But there's a big European funded project that is interested in a lot of questions related to positive animal welfare, where in the
yeah,
past research has almost exclusively focused on the absence of negative experiences, pain, but
yeah,
we haven't really given any attention to the lack of positive experiences a farm
yeah,
animal might have, right? There's no sense where animals could be curious, where they could enjoy the company of others in any meaningful way, comfort and the like. And these are really important questions we have to investigate.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm not sure what the philosophical community will in the end think of these
yeah,
papers when they're published. Often it seems to me that philosophers aren't really evaluated based on those kinds of papers. But I'm lucky because now I have a permanent position, so I can engage in that work.
exactly.
Whether or
Yeah,
not it gets rewarded, it's what's interesting to me, anyhow.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, certainly for young philosophers, that's a big issue. And at the end of your synthetic philosophy article, you mentioned that there isn't really a good way where we can evaluate dissertations in synthetic philosophy. We don't have these uniform standards. It's unclear how we should evaluate perhaps those candidates on the job market if they engage in synthetic philosophy, whereas just traditional analytic philosophy, we can evaluate their premises, their argument structure, and the like. Um, where that seems harder, so perhaps that discourages people from engaging in that work.
yeah. And I think part of the problem is, so you're right about that. And I mean, you're right that I said that, and I think you're right about the effect of that. Not just that I said it, but I think it latches on to
Hmm.
something. I think part of the problem is an interesting one, namely, you might think that the way to evaluate synthetic philosophy is, say, by contributions to other fields or by opening up fields, etc. But there you really then get into the problem is that philosophers are in a very poor position,
Hmm.
and hiring committees and promotion committees in evaluating that. And more than even in other areas, then would really have to farm out the evaluation.
Hmm.
And I think that generates actually rather complex challenges. So I do think there's a real issue lurking here. On the other hand, all analytic philosophy is not traditional philosophy for more than a century. So I think all ways of doing things differently um, struggle with a variant of this challenge. And I think the question is really, um, do young people see the potential to make contribution or to have be ambitious, such that they're willing to see a high reward despite the high risk of
Hmm.
falling between different cracks. I mean, it doesn't help, I think, for intellectual life more generally that that there is a clear retrenchment in a lot of universities and in a lot of countries toward universities from absolute levels and perhaps even relative levels. And so that I think will discourage minor risk taking. On the other hand, that also generates an incentive to be really different than everybody else. So
Hmm.
I think it's hard to foresee. I think I was visiting at Chapman, but went to a party at Irvine, and it's quite clear that Irvine's one of the best philosophy of science, perhaps philosophy departments more generally, and the people working there, they're using methods in parts that really were not, including agent-based modeling, but also kind of stuff that Skirms promotes that really weren't as mainstream as 25 years ago
Hmm.
for philosophers. It's not that they weren't used at all, but I think that one PhD after another getting a good job, as the Irvine department seems to do. So I do think that sometimes, a shift is happening, even though the mainstream conception isn't quite there yet.
Yeah.
And I think we are seeing that, uh, well, I'll put it like this. What was for me eye-opening is when I went back to Williamson's Philosophy of Philosophy. He wrote a second edition of it. And I really
Hmm.
noticed that while at the same time defending, let's call it traditional philosophy, he was also shifting what traditional philosophy was about. Namely, it was about model building, right? And from the perspective of the last century, that's an enormous shift,
Hmm.
right? So rather than being focused on arguments and clarity, um, the arguments and clarity are now within this context of model building, right? And I think you and I are enough philosophers of science to know that if you really are going to focus on model building, then the virtues apt to it are not going to be clarity and arguments. They're going to be fruitfulness and and figuring out trade-offs of various sorts. And
Hmm.
that's not wholly at odds with the analytic self-conception. David Lewis likes cost-benefit analysis, but what the cost-benefit analysis is going to be about is really then going to shift. So I do think that if even Williamson's defense of contemporary practices in philosophy has to appeal to abduction and model building, then
Hmm.
there's a sense in which synthetic philosophy is already taking over, even when the mainstream doesn't realize it yet. So I do
Hmm.
think we're in a larger cultural shift.
Yeah, I think Laurie Paul has made similar
Yeah,
arguments, as well as Peter Godfrey Smith, of course.
yeah,
You'll be
yeah,
pleased to hear that in my philosophy classes at the University of Reading, I've
yeah,
also introduced philosophy as a type
yeah,
of model building to my
yeah,
students, which to them seemed at first a bit strange, but I used um, Levin's triangle of the trade-offs between realism, generality, and precision, where
yeah.
you can have models that only maximize two, but never all
Never
three, and
all
that's
three
the
of them. Yeah,
trade-off.
yeah,
And I told my students, look, a lot of what philosophers do is maximizing um, generality
yeah,
at the cost, essentially, of everything else.
yeah,
Where they're trying to provide accounts that are so general, say the famous statement that everything is water,
yeah,
that it's no longer precise, it's not realistic at all, and those are of course not the only three virtues. Um, but there is this tendency of philosophers to try to be so broad as possible, and that also attracts synthetic philosophers that there's always a danger then to really not offer anything useful anymore. And so this practice turn in philosophy towards more thinking about where your theories are applied within practice, say in political science, that adds a helpful angle where philosophers can think about how they can provide better models, perhaps.
Yeah. I read an early draft of Laurie Pohl's paper when she was circulating it, and and I remember thinking, and I think this actually ended up in the final paper. I should look at it because
Hmm.
it's been a few years. But I remember thinking that this whole movement also is an appeal to the authority of science more generally in philosophy,
Hmm.
right? So there's a kind of a good chunk of 20th century philosophy understood itself as kind of a distinct expertise about concepts or conceptual analysis and arguments and making distinctions about concepts, right? Let's call that a cluster view within
Hmm.
analytic philosophy. But when you start saying, well, actually, what we're doing is modeling, and we're building on modeling traditions, as you can also see in other modeling exercises, then that I think really tells you that within philosophy and meta philosophy, there's I don't want to call it a lack of self-confidence, but I think it points to the fact that there's a general sense that in order to explain and justify what one has to do, one has to explain how it is, in an important sense, scientific in character,
Hmm.
even merely by
Interesting.
analogy. Um, I used to call that Newton's challenge to philosophy because I think the style of argument really develops as a response to the amazing successes of Newton at the end of the 17th
Hmm.
century. I've stopped using that because Newton himself also was interested in metaphysics, and
Right.
said it's kind of confusing if I claim this. Um, but I think philosophy is not isolated. It's a part of a broader intellectual culture. And I think the advantage that synthetic philosophers have is that within the culture, having expertise and being scientific are highly valued things. And we see that even in the projects like Laurie herself is really collaborating with scientists all the time now, but when she wrote that paper, it was less distinct in her. I think it's very clear that yeah, if the
Hmm.
metaphysicians and the modal logicians are basically appealing to the authority of science, then synthetic philosophy has a real opportunity. That was the point of that digression.
Hmm.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, those were beautiful final words in a way. So perhaps I'll ask a final question. Where do you think synthetic philosophy is going in the next, say, 10 years?
Well, so you and I, and you especially, have real affinity with Darwinian reasoning, but I think I don't think we've milked yet
Hmm.
in philosophy the cheapness of computer power. So I think projects that can leverage cheap computer power with theoretical fecundity, I think those are really going to be um, intellectually really exciting. I'm not sure, whether people will get jobs, but I do
Hmm.
think there's a lot of just I suspect that in 20 to 30 years, people will call it very low hanging fruit there because so little is being done. And I think what's being done is tends to be like digital humanities, citation
Hmm.
analysis is now also being internalized in philosophy. And we're seeing a lot of agent-based models. But I think modeling, but I think, there's enormous amount of computer-based projects that we're not pursuing yet
Hmm.
that I think as a tool for philosophical inquiry will be very robust. So that's a kind of prophecy where I'm not sure I can actually give you the detailed
That's
content,
right. Yeah.
but yeah, I do think that's where the a lot of action will be.
Hmm. Yeah, we didn't mention AI there, but that might
No,
outcompete us philosophers at some point, at least in
yes,
terms of output.
I often joke seriously. I mean that the economists run the real risk of being displaced by computer
Hmm.
science and AI, particularly if it turns out that models that don't make economic assumptions outperform predictively models that do.
Mm.
And I think we're sort of on the threshold of that, if not
Yeah.
already in that, in quite a few areas of economics. You see something like this also in climate science, where let's call
Mm.
it theory empty models do better than the theory heavy models, right? And I think those are Um, I have some let's call it epistemic normative doubts about these
Mm.
projects, but I think sociologically it's undeniable that that's happening. Um, I'm hopeful still that philosophy won't be obsolete in this respect, but I've started to use LLMs to write exam questions,
Mm.
and I could easily imagine that a whole bunch of low-level assessment is done by LLMs at some point, and so
Mm.
I do think there are risks, their job risks there, but I also think there are going to be job opportunities if we can unleash the statistical power of these networks. Maybe interesting philosophical questions will
Yeah.
be answered.
Yeah. Perhaps we should have another episode at some point on
Hmm.
AI and philosophy.
Yeah, I have now a paper in the ethics of AI that I co-wrote
Oh.
with a bunch of Miss Federica Russo, well-known philosopher of causation, and Jean Wegeman, a linguist. And so I am interested in the field, but yeah, it's also becoming so fast-moving that
Mm.
um, the nice thing about being in history of philosophy is that the people are dead that you're writing about, and the fields are not so fast moving, so you can hop around a bit. But these areas where, tens of thousands of researchers are working at the same time,
Mm.
it's I'm not sure how much.
It's harder to say
Uh,
something novel there. Yeah, a lot of
yeah,
philosophers are certainly jumping on that. And
yeah,
similarly, the questions I've worked on with animal consciousness, there's certainly a pull that, well, what about AI consciousness? Can we apply
yes,
this
yeah, yeah,
there?
yeah,
And
yeah,
in a way that it's unavoidable that I'll have to talk about that as well. AI
yes.
sentience and the like.
What's neat
Um,
about that is that issue, if you go back to Turing and to some early Putnam papers, it was really clearly on the agenda, it was half a century ago.
yeah.
And I do like the fact that now it's coming back and we have, both new tools of AI and also I think a lot of philosophical development. So be curious to see if our generation does better on these issues. Um, yeah, that's I I really think that uh, philosophy today is really in a really incredibly fortunate position because we really can tackle so many interesting
Hmm.
issues. And I don't, I do think there's a kind of mini crisis in analytic philosophy about what's the project about and what are the standards. But I think professional philosophers as a whole, there are all these amazing opportunities for projects and topics to think about. And yeah, I I don't know if I will make any special contribution to it, but I think synthetic philosophers will, and that gives me a great deal
Hmm.
of joy and happiness.
Yeah, Eric, thanks so much for coming on this podcast.
Thank you, Walter. Walter, I hope I didn't disappoint, and
Oh no,
I
I think
enjoyed
those
it.
were great contributions. I hope that listeners like this episode as well. I wish you all a good week. And with that,
Same here.
bye.